You want to know the moment everything changed. It wasn't some grand speech. It wasn't a president standing at a podium with fireworks behind him and an orchestra playing something dramatic. It wasn't a general in dress uniform reading from a teleprompter about sacrifice and glory and the weight of civilization. No, it was a mechanic. A 26-year-old woman named Priya Mehta, covered in hydraulic fluid and engine grease up to her elbows, crouching underneath the belly of a Kodiak-class atmospheric interceptor on the flight deck of the ISS Varanasi, a ship that, by every sovereignty assessment, should not have been flying. The sovereignty observer assigned to document human military readiness, a being called Assessor Velkarath of the Theron delegation, standing about 9 feet tall, gray-skinned, with 3 sets of eyes arranged vertically, and a recording filament that hovered around its head like a small metallic halo, had been watching her for about 40 minutes. Velkarath had witnessed the collapse of 14 civilizations. It had watched species crumble under the weight of their own ambition. It had filed reports on beings that had looked at the approaching Dreth Armada and simply stopped functioning, stopped fighting, stopped existing as a cohesive unit. The Theron archives were full of civilizations that had been assessed as promising, but had ultimately failed the fundamental test of pressure. Velkarath was not cruel, it was simply experienced. So when Priya Mehta looked up from underneath that broken interceptor, grease on her forehead, a ratchet in her left hand, an electromagnetic torque driver clenched between her teeth, and noticed the massive gray alien observer standing 3 feet away from her with all 6 eyes open and recording, she did something Velkarath had not, in 400 years of assessment work, ever seen a pre-war species member do. She pulled the torque driver out of her teeth. She said, "You want to hand me that conduit clamp, the blue one, on the tray to your left." Velkarath looked down at the tray. It picked up the blue conduit clamp. It handed it to her. She said thanks and went back to work. That was the moment. That was the moment Velkarath's report shifted from a standard pre-extinction assessment to something it hadn't filed in 4 centuries. A survival probability flag. Segment 2, the setup Earth 2089. Let me back up. Because you need to understand what the world looked like before all of this makes sense. The year was 2089, and I know that sounds like a long way from now, but the thing people never tell you about the future is that it arrives slowly and then all at once. You don't wake up one morning and find yourself in the future. You just keep waking up, and one day you notice that the coffee machine talks back to you, and there are magnetic rail lines where the highway used to be, and the hospital across the street from where you grew up is now a vertical farming tower 40 stories tall. The future sneaks up on you. By 2089, humanity had made it through some things. Real things, hard things. The water crises of the 2040s and 2050s had reshaped every coastline government on the planet. The Great Atmospheric Recalibration, which is what scientists called it when they were being diplomatic, and which most people just called the bad decade, had forced a kind of global cooperation that no amount of treaty writing had ever managed to achieve. When 1/3 of the world's coastline started flooding, and the crop yields in 6 of the largest agricultural nations dropped by 40% in the same 7-year window, people stopped arguing about borders quite so much. Not because they became enlightened. Because they became desperate. And desperate people, it turns out, are very good at solving problems when they finally get out of their own way. So by 2089, Earth wasn't some utopia. Let me be clear about that. There were still problems. There was still crime and poverty and political corruption, and all the ordinary ugliness that comes with being a species that evolved from territorial primates and only recently figured out indoor plumbing on a cosmic timescale. But there was also the International Space Sovereignty Act. There was the Joint Defense Cooperative. There was the ISS fleet, Not the old International Space Station, but the Integrated Stellar Systems Fleet, 47 warships of varying class built over 30 years by 11 nations working in coordinated construction yards in low Earth orbit, on the Moon, and in the asteroid processing facilities out in the belt. Humanity had been building for a fight it didn't fully believe was coming. Until it came. First contact happened on March 14, 2046. Not with the Dreth. With the Sovereignty. A probe appeared in the outer system, beyond Neptune, just sitting there, broadcasting on a frequency that the SETI arrays picked up inside of 6 hours. Not because the probe was trying to be subtle, because it wanted to be found. The Theran are old enough and patient enough to understand that the best way to introduce yourself to a new species is to let them find you first. It makes them feel slightly less like prey. The Sovereignty is a collective of 31 species, the oldest of which, the Theran, have been spacefaring for roughly 12,000 years. Not all of the member species are friendly. Not all of them are peaceful. But they're organized, they have rules, and they have a standing policy on new species that they call the Assessment Protocol, which is a very polite name for what amounts to a galactic probationary period. The Assessment Protocol works like this. When a new species achieves a certain level of technological development, the Sovereignty sends observers. Those observers watch. They evaluate. They file reports. And then the Council of 30 decides whether the new species gets an invitation to join the Sovereignty as a protected member state or gets classified as a Tier 0 uncontrolled variable and essentially left to figure things out on its own, which, in practical terms, means being left exposed to things like the Dreth. The Dreth are not members of the Sovereignty. The Dreth are the reason the Sovereignty exists. I'll tell you what I know about the Dreth from the briefings I was present for, and I'll be honest about where my knowledge ends. They're not a civilization in any sense that maps onto what we mean by that word. They're more like, imagine if a culture had decided, at some point in its deep evolutionary history, that expansion was not a strategy but a biological imperative. That consuming and absorbing was not something you did to survive, it was the point. The whole point. The only point. They don't want resources in the way we want resources. They don't want territory in the way we want territory. They want absence. They want the space where you used to be. The Sovereignty had been fighting a defensive campaign against Dreth expansion for 6,000 years. They'd lost 11 member worlds in that time. 11 entire inhabited planets. The species on those worlds gone. Not conquered, not enslaved. Gone. The Sovereignty found humanity in the middle of that fight. And their assessment of us was, at its core, a single question. Are these people going to be assets or liabilities? The first 40 years of the Assessment Protocol had given the Theran observers a complicated picture. On the positive side, humans were adaptive. Humans were creative in ways that seemed to genuinely surprise even experienced Theran analysts. Humans had survived environmental disasters, political collapses, resource wars, and a genuinely staggering number of self-inflicted near-extinction events, and were still here, still functional, still building. On the negative side, humans were chaotic. Humans disagreed with each other constantly. Humans had, as recently as 20 years prior, been engaged in active military conflict with other humans. Humans had no unified command structure, no galactic diplomatic experience, and no reliable way to predict how they'd behave under genuinely existential pressure. The kind of pressure that came not from other humans, but from something that wanted to erase them from the universe entirely. The Dreth had been detected moving toward the inner Sovereignty border, the border that on the outer edge included the Sol system, in 2087. ETA to first engagement, 2 years. The Sovereignty Council had a decision to make. They gave humanity 18 months to demonstrate operational readiness. Which brings us back to the Varanasi. Segment 3. The ship ISS Varanasi. The Varanasi was the third largest ship in the Joint Defense Fleet. She was a Meridian-class combined arms carrier, which meant she was built to carry both orbital bombardment systems and atmospheric interceptor wings, which is not a combination that makes your engineering team happy. Those two functions want different things from a ship. Orbital systems want stability, mass, slow, deliberate maneuvering. Atmospheric wings want speed, tight turning tolerances, launch and recovery systems that can cycle in under 90 seconds. Making them work on the same hull is the kind of problem that gives shipwrights gray hair. The Varanasi had been launched 14 months ahead of the Dreth detection. She was, by the best reckoning of her builders, about 73% ready when she was commissioned. The remaining 27% was going to be finished underway. That's not unusual. That's how most warships in human history have worked. You build them as fast as you can because you don't have the luxury of waiting until they're perfect. Her crew was 4,312 people from 22 nations. Her commanding officer was Vice Admiral Naledi Dlamini, 54 years old, former commander of the Southern African Defense Forces Orbital Branch, the kind of person who had the rare gift of being able to make hard decisions quickly without making the people around her feel like they were disposable. I served on the Varanasi as a tactical communications officer for the 14 months leading up to what later got called the Sovereignty Assessment Event. Though on the ship, we just called it the visit, because nobody liked the official name, and Naledi Dlamini had a well-documented allergy to bureaucratic vocabulary. I was there for all of it. I was standing 8 feet from Priya Mehta when she handed the conduit clamp back to Velkorath. The observers arrived on a Tuesday. I don't know why that matters to me, but it does. There's something about a Tuesday. Nothing important is supposed to happen on a Tuesday. Tuesdays are for maintenance schedules and budget reviews and arguing about the coffee ration in the lower deck galley. The Theron delegation ship, a vessel about a third the size of the Varanasi, slate gray and perfectly geometric in a way that made your brain itch slightly when you looked at it for too long, pulled alongside us at 900-hour ship time and matched our velocity with a precision that our navigation team stood around watching in genuinely awed silence. They'd sent 3 observers aboard. Velkorath, the primary assessor, who I've already mentioned. A younger Theron called Assessor Seal, who was apparently something like a junior analyst and who had the habit of making a very soft sound, somewhere between a hum and a click, whenever something surprised it, which on the Varanasi happened roughly every 12 minutes. And a third being who was not Theron at all, but was instead a member species called the Maxura, a species that had been assessed and admitted to the sovereignty approximately 3,000 years ago, and who served primarily as translators and cultural interpreters. This one was called Interpreter Than, and it stood about 5 feet tall, had bilateral symmetry unlike the Theron, looked vaguely like someone had assembled a person out of smooth amber-colored glass, and spoke standard consortium in a voice that sounded like music being played in a room next door. They came aboard through the portside docking collar at 9:14. The Admiral met them personally at the collar, with a 4-person honor guard and no additional fanfare, because Naledi Dlamini had read everything we had on Theron diplomatic customs, and the one consistent point across all of it was that the Theron had 0 patience for ceremony and unlimited patience for competence. She shook Velkorath's hand, or the nearest Theron equivalent, which involved a brief contact between forearms. She said, "Welcome to the Varanasi. I'll give you access to every section of this ship. The only thing I ask is that you stay out of the way of my crew when they're working, not for protocol reasons. Just because this ship is short-staffed and my people need to concentrate." Interpreter Than translated. Velkarath regarded her with 4 of its 6 eyes. Then it said something. Than translated. The assessor says this is acceptable. The assessor also says that you are the first commanding officer of a pre-assessment species who has not asked how long the assessment will take. Naledi Dlamini said, because I don't care how long it takes. I care about my ship being ready. If your assessment and my readiness happen at the same time, that's efficient. Now, can I offer you something? Than, what does your physiology do with liquid? Than made a sound that, we eventually understood, was laughter. The assessment had begun. Segment 4, What They Saw Day by Day. I need to tell you what those 3 observers saw over the next 31 days. Because the report Velkarath filed, which was eventually shared with Joint Defense Command as part of the sovereignty's deliberations, and which I've read in the translated version more times than I can count, is not what any of us would have predicted. It doesn't describe a military vessel. It describes something they didn't have a category for. Day 3. The Varanasi's primary weapons calibration array had a fault in the targeting integration system. Not a catastrophic fault, a calibration drift that was throwing off the long-range beam weapons by about 0.003 degrees, which sounds insignificant until you're trying to hit a target that's 3,000 kilometers away and moving. Chief Weapons Officer Lieutenant Commander Reza Shirazi had been awake for 31 hours working on it. He wasn't ordered to be awake for 31 hours. Dlamini had actually told him 3 times to sleep. He'd said yes each time and then found reasons to stay at his station. When the fault was finally isolated, a microscopic fracture in one of the quantum phase aligners that took 6 hours to diagnose and 4 minutes to replace, Shirazi stood up from his console, stretched his back with a sound like a building settling, looked at the fixed readout and said, very quietly to no one in particular, "There you are, you little nightmare." Then he went and got a cup of coffee from the galley, stood in the corridor for approximately 90 seconds doing nothing but staring at the wall, and went back to his station to run verification tests. Assessor Seal, who had been watching from the far corner of the weapons bay, made the hum-click sound twice in rapid succession. In the report, Velkarath noted, human crew members appear to maintain acute problem focus independent of formal directive structures. The individual designated Shirazi demonstrated what our assessment framework would classify as self-directed mission completion drive, a behavioral trait typically only observed in species with 3 or more generations of spacefaring adaptation. In humans, it appears to be native. Day 7. We ran a combat drill. Full ship, simulated dreath contact scenario, every station active, the bridge running on emergency protocols while the interceptor wing launched and recovered on a 90-second cycle. Drills on the Varanasi were not comfortable. They were not designed to be comfortable. Commander of Training, Major Yuki Hashimoto, a 37-year-old former test pilot with the kind of focused intensity that made junior crew members feel like their every movement was being evaluated, which it was, ran the drills as close to actual combat conditions as the ship's systems could simulate. That meant sensory overload. It meant competing alerts and system warnings. It meant some stations receiving contradictory information and having to make judgment calls in real time. It meant, on this particular day, a simulated hull breach on Deck 9 in the middle of the drill, which required damage control teams to respond while the weapons systems were active and the interceptors were cycling. The Theran observers watched from the bridge, behind the command rail. What they saw was chaos that wasn't chaos. It looked like chaos. It sounded like chaos, people talking over each other, alarms going off, 2 different department heads shouting conflicting status updates across the bridge. But if you watched it long enough, and if you had the analytical capability of a species that had been assessing militaries for 400 years, you started to see the pattern underneath the noise. Every single person on that bridge knew exactly what the person next to them was doing, not because they were mind-linked or networked or mechanically synchronized, because they drilled it until it was muscle memory, and beneath the noise, they were maintaining a constant low-level awareness of each other that was almost organic. A junior navigation officer named Cadet Olusegun Ademi, 18 years old on his first deployment, clearly terrified, had his station go offline in the middle of the breach scenario. He didn't freeze. He turned to the officer at the adjacent station, said, "Chen, I need a feed from your secondary." And Chen, without looking up, said, "Taking the left side, you have the right," and they split the workload without a single second of hesitation or argument. The drill lasted 47 minutes. Velkarath's report on that day was the longest single entry in the document. It ended with, "We do not have an assessment category for what we observed. Humans appear to achieve operational cohesion through a combination of formalized training and informal adaptive trust networks that emerge spontaneously under pressure. The Dreth have destroyed 11 sovereignty member worlds. None of those species demonstrated this behavioral matrix in pre-contact assessment. We recommend the Council consider whether our existing assessment frameworks are adequate for evaluating humanity." Day 11. This is the one that I think about the most. There was a crew member on the Varanasi named Engineer Specialist Dawit Bikel, stationed in the lower propulsion section. Ethiopian-born, came up through the Joint Defense Technical Training Program, had been on the Varanasi since commissioning. Dawit had a habit. Every morning at 600 before his shift started, he would go to a small storage alcove off the main engineering corridor, one of those spaces that exists between sections on large ships, not quite a room, not quite a corridor, just a gap in the architecture, and he would sit on an equipment crate and read. Not technical documents, not mission files. He read novels. Old ones. Physical copies, which was unusual enough on a spaceship that people noticed. He had 6 of them, stacked in his bunk locker, and he rotated through them. The ones I remember seeing were a battered copy of Middlemarch in Amharic translation, something by a Kenyan author whose name I can't quite remember now, and a very worn paperback of The Count of Monte Cristo in French. He read for 30 minutes every morning, without fail, even during the assessment, even when the ship was running 2 consecutive days of drills. Assessor Seal found him there on day 11. I don't know if it was following Dawit specifically, or if it simply happened to be exploring that section of the ship. But it found him, and it stood at the entrance to the alcove for the entire 30 minutes. Dawit didn't look up for the first 20 minutes. Then, without putting the book down, he said, "There's room if you want to sit. That crate on the right is empty." Seal made the hum-click sound. It didn't sit. The Theron aren't built for human furniture. But it stayed for the remaining 10 minutes, and when Dawit closed the book and stood up to go to his shift, he said, "Same time tomorrow if you want. Bring a snack. I have no idea what you eat." In the report, Velkarath noted, I believe because Seal described the encounter, human crew members appear to maintain individual interior lives separate from their professional function. This is not unique to advanced species, but the capacity to sustain and compartmentalize such interiority under operational stress conditions is atypical. The individual maintains emotional and intellectual resources that appear to replenish through practices independent of formal rest protocols. This may be relevant to long campaign endurance assessments. Day 15. The Varanasi received a distress signal. This is not as dramatic as it sounds. Distress signals in the outer system in 2089 were not uncommon. Civilian prospecting vessels, research outposts, the occasional commercial transit ship that ran into engine trouble. The Joint Defense Fleet had standing orders to respond to any distress signal within effective response range, combat readiness notwithstanding. The signal came from a civilian science vessel called the Guoshujing, operated by the Beijing Astrophysics Institute, which had experienced a catastrophic oxygen recycling failure approximately 340,000 kilometers off the Varanasi's course. There were 11 people aboard the Guoshujing. The Admiral's response time to that distress signal from receipt to course change order was 4 seconds. 4 seconds. I was on the bridge, I counted. She didn't call a meeting. She didn't consult the mission protocol files. She didn't ask anyone what the regulations said about diverting a military vessel during an assessment period. She heard the signal. She looked at the navigation display for approximately 3 seconds and she said, "Helm, bring us to bearing 227 Mark 14, best sustainable speed. Medical, prepare for emergency casualty intake. Someone tell our observers we're taking a detour." The Theron delegation was briefed by interpreter Than within 90 seconds. Velkarath's response as translated was, "The assessor notes this. The assessor has no objections." We reached the Guoshujing in 4 hours and 20 minutes. The 11 crew members were evacuated with, at the final count, an average blood oxygen level of 81%, which is survivable but not by a comfortable margin. The ship's CMO, Dr. Adiz Okonkwo, ran a medical bay that looked, for about 3 hours, like controlled bedlam. People everywhere, IV lines, oxygen masks, 2 of the scientists in genuine respiratory distress. All 11 survived. When it was over, when the rescued crew was stable and sleeping in the overflow bunks, and the Guoshujing had been marked for recovery, I walked past the medical bay and saw Velkarath standing in the doorway, just watching. 6 eyes open. Recording filament active. I don't know how long it stood there. In the report it wrote, "Diversion of a primary assessment period military asset to conduct civilian rescue operations at measurable cost to assessment timeline. Decision made in under 5 seconds by commanding officer without formal consultation. Human military structures appear to embed civilian protection as a core operational value rather than a secondary consideration. This is atypical. Among the species we have assessed, military assets at high readiness status universally deprioritize non-combat rescue operations. Humans appear to regard this as non-negotiable. The Council should note this as a significant behavioral marker." Day 20. Priya Mehta's interceptor. I told you about her at the beginning, and now you have enough context to understand what made that moment matter. Priya was senior mechanic, first class, assigned to the Varanasi's 2nd Interceptor Wing. Her specific area was Kodiak-class atmospheric fighters, the ones the wing used for high-altitude planetary combat operations. The Kodiak is a beautiful machine if you're the kind of person who looks at a weapon system and sees a machine. It's got an electromagnetic intake system that allows it to operate in atmospheres ranging from near vacuum to dense gas giants, a dual-phase engine arrangement that can switch between ion drive and chemical burn in under a second, and handling characteristics that test pilots describe as being like riding a very fast, very opinionated horse. They also break in interesting and creative ways. Priya's specific Kodiak, the one she'd been assigned as personal maintenance responsibility for 14 months, had developed a fault in the atmospheric intake calibration system. Under normal diagnostic conditions, it read clean. Under simulated combat load, it threw an irregular flutter in the intake at certain speed-to-altitude combinations that could, in the wrong circumstances, cause an engine surge. Not a certain crash, just an elevated probability of one. Priya had identified it, filed the report, gotten the part didn't fix it, gotten a second part didn't fix it either. The fault was somewhere in the interaction between the intake system and the engine management software, a ghost she called it. A ghost in the machine. She'd been working on it in her off hours for 6 days. On day 20, the interceptor wing was scheduled for a full combat readiness evaluation, with the Theron observers watching, which meant Priya's Kodiak needed to either be flyable or pulled from the line. She'd been under that aircraft for 6 hours when Velkorath came into the bay. The rest of the story you know. What I want to tell you is what happened after. After Priya handed the conduit clamp back to Velkorath, she worked for another hour and 40 minutes. Velkorath stood nearby the entire time, occasionally handing her things from the tray, which she asked for without ever seeming to think about the fact that the thing handing her tools was a 9-foot alien observer from a civilization 12,000 years older than ours. Then she slid out from under the Kodiak, sat up on the deck, ran a diagnostic from her handheld unit, watched the numbers for 30 seconds and said, "There it is." The ghost was gone. Velkorath looked at the diagnostic display. It said something. Than, who had come in quietly at some point, translated. The assessor asks, "You worked on this for 6 days. You were not ordered to spend your personal rest time on this repair. Why?" Priya looked up at it. She said, "Because SGT, Olive flies this bird. And SGT, Olive has a daughter who's about 8 months old and who he's trying to get home to." Silence for a moment. Then the assessor says, "The pilot's family status was not operationally relevant to the repair." Priya said, "Yeah, it was." And she went to go wash her hands. In the report, Velkorath wrote, "And I consider this the line that changed everything. We have observed species who fight for territory. We have observed species who fight for ideology. We have observed species who fight because they are built to fight and know no other mode. We have not, in 400 years of assessment work, observed a species that fights for each other at the individual level with such consistency that it appears to be a baseline behavioral default rather than an exceptional response to extreme stimulus. This may require the development of entirely new assessment categories." Segment 5. The Conversation, Day 28. 3 days before the assessment ended, Velkorath requested a private meeting with Admiral Dlamini. I wasn't in that meeting. Nobody was except the Admiral, Velkorath, and interpreter Than. What I know about it comes from what the Admiral told me afterward, and she told me because I was the person who had the misfortune of being in her office doorway with a tablet full of communications logs when she came back from that meeting, and she needed to tell someone. She sat down. She looked at her desk for a moment. Then she said, "It asked me if we were afraid." I said, "Of the Dreth." She said, "Of everything, of the scope of it, of what we don't know." It said, and this is the part that's going to stay with me for a while, it said that every species it's ever assessed by this stage in the process has begun showing what it called contraction signals. Leaders become more cautious. Crews become more anxious. People stop doing the small things, the reading, the music, the conversations. The species turns inward, and it wanted to know if we were going to do that. I said, "What did you tell it?" She said, "I told it that I couldn't speak for humanity. I told it that I could only speak for the Varanasi. And that on this ship, on this specific ship, my people were going to wake up every morning and do their jobs as well as they knew how to do them. And when they couldn't do their jobs, they were going to figure out how to do their jobs better. And when they finished doing their jobs, they were going to eat and sleep and read novels and argue about the coffee ration and call their families, because that's what people do. And if that was contraction or not contraction, or whatever the assessment framework called it, that was going to have to be the answer." She paused. Then she said, "It told me something. It told me that the Dreth don't fear opponents who are strong. They face strong opponents. They know how to break strong opponents. What they don't have a strategy for, what they've never encountered in 6,000 years, is opponents who don't stop being human while they're fighting." It said the Dreth's model assumes that under sufficient existential pressure, any species eventually reduces to its base survival function, that everything else falls away. The reading and the music and the small repairs done in off hours for personal reasons, all of it falls away, and what's left is just a survival mechanism, and survival mechanisms can be broken. But it had been watching us for 28 days, and it said, she stopped, looked at the window. It said it wasn't sure we reduced. Silence. She said, it said, we've been watching your species say we've got this for 28 days. We've been waiting for the moment when that stops being true and becomes a performance. We're still waiting. Segment 6. The test, day 31. The last day of the assessment. It started at 300 in the morning. Unannounced. No pre-briefing, no notification, nothing. At 300, the Varanasi's tactical systems went active with a contact alert, 12 inbound signatures, moving at Dreth approach velocity, bearing consistent with the Dreth advance vector that JDF intelligence had projected. I want to be very clear. This was a sovereignty-initiated simulation. The contacts were not real. Velkorath had coordinated with the Theron delegation ship to project false sensor returns into the Varanasi's tactical systems, realistic enough to fool our detection arrays, positioned and moving in patterns that matched actual Dreth pre-attack formations. The crew of the Varanasi did not know it was a simulation. I did not know it was a simulation. At 300, we thought we were looking at the first real Dreth contact. I was asleep. I was in my bunk on deck 7. I was in the middle of a dream about, honestly, I don't remember, something ordinary, something that had nothing to do with any of this. The general quarters alarm is a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. It doesn't sound dramatic, not like in old movies with the blaring horns and the dramatic score underneath. The GQ alarm on the Varanasi was a specific pattern of tones, 3 short, 1 long, 2 short, that the designers had chosen specifically because it doesn't trigger panic. It's urgent, but it's not frantic. It's designed to move people without stopping their brains. 37 seconds. That's how long it took from the first alarm tone to the bridge, being fully staffed with every primary station manned and active. I know because I was counting as I ran. The Admiral was already on the bridge when I arrived, which told me she'd been awake, or woke up faster than I've ever seen a human being wake up. She was at the command console, uniform on, coffee in hand. I have genuinely no idea how she had coffee, looking at the tactical display with the same expression she wore when she was doing the ship's maintenance budget. Calm, focused, working the problem. Status, she said. 12 contacts, bearing 227 by 14, velocity consistent with Dreth advance formation. Distance 3.2 million kilometers, closing at approximately 40,000 kilometers per minute. Weapons. Online, calibration confirmed. Interceptors. Second wing on deck, first wing in launch queue, ready in 4 minutes. Communications. JDF command advised. Sovereignty liaison notified. No response yet from command, we may be first contact. She looked at the display for about 3 seconds. Then she said, and I want to be precise about what she said because I've thought about it a lot since. All right, this is what we trained for. I want a targeting solution on the lead formation element, and I want it in the next 2 minutes. I want damage control stations pre-positioned. I want medical standing by. And I want someone to get Engineer Bikel on the line because if we take hits I'm going to need those engines running. Then she said, we've got this. She didn't say it dramatically. She didn't say it for effect. She said it the way you'd say I've got the groceries when someone offers to help you carry them. Simple, factual. Like the possibility of its not being true wasn't something she was entertaining. We've got this. What happened next in the next 12 minutes is, I think, the purest demonstration of what Velkorath had been watching for 31 days. The bridge ran like a machine, but not the cold kind. The warm kind. The kind where every moving part knows what every other moving part is doing, not because they're programmed, but because they know each other. Shirazi called out targeting data with the same quiet focus he'd had staring at his console at 400 in the morning after 31 hours awake. Cadet Adami on navigation, the 18-year-old who'd been terrified on day 7, had his station go to secondary display at minute 4 and switched over to the backup system so smoothly that if I hadn't been watching for exactly that kind of thing, I would have missed it. Priya Mehta's Kodiak, the one she'd spent 6 days tracking a ghost fault in, launched clean on the first cycle. SGT, Olive at the controls, the one with the 8-month-old daughter. Launched clean. No flutter, no surge. Clean. At minute 12, the Sovereignty delegation ship broadcast the simulation termination code, and the 12 contacts dissolved from our screens. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the Admiral said, very quietly, "Stand down from general quarters." "Nice work, everyone." She said it the way you'd say good morning. I found out later what Velkorath had been doing during those 12 minutes. It had not been watching the tactical displays. It had been watching the crew. Standing in the back of the bridge, recording filament completely active, all 6 eyes moving across faces and stations, and the small individual moments that a tactical display doesn't capture. Dawit B. Kell called to his engines at 300, arriving at his station with his copy of the Count of Monte Cristo still in his hand. He'd been reading at 300, and when the alarm came, he'd grabbed his uniform and the book out of reflex, and he ran to the engines with it and put it down on the console beside him, and kept it there through the whole 12 minutes. A 600-page French novel on the console, while he managed a warship's propulsion system through a simulated alien contact. Interpreter Than, standing next to Velkorath, said afterward that the assessor had identified that as the key moment. Not the targeting solutions or the launch cycle or the calibration or any of the things the assessor had been sent to evaluate. The book. The fact that the book was there. Segment 7. The report and what came after. Velkorath's final assessment report was 47 pages in the translated version. I've read every word of it. The formal recommendation to the Sovereignty Council was a Category 1 provisional membership offer, which is the highest status available to a precontact species. Only 3 other species in Sovereignty history had received Category 1 first assessments. But the part of the report that got quoted everywhere, the part that Interpreter Than told us months later, had been the subject of more council debate than any single assessment document in 300 years, was not the formal recommendation. It was the personal observation Velkorath appended to the end. In translation, it reads, "I have assessed 14 civilizations over 400 years of service to the Sovereignty Assessment Directorate. I have filed reports on species of remarkable intelligence, remarkable physical capability, remarkable organizational sophistication. I have also filed reports on the final assessments of species that subsequently did not survive their first contact with the Dreth. In reviewing those reports now, I note a commonality. Every species that failed the final pressure test had, in the period before that test, begun to become something simpler than what they were. The complexity reduced. The interior lives contracted. They became their fear, and their fear was not enough. Humanity, in 31 days of close observation under the full knowledge of an existential threat, did not contract. They read novels at 3 in the morning. They fixed engines for personal reasons. They diverted warships to rescue 11 strangers at measurable operational cost without a second's hesitation. They argued about coffee. They handed tools to alien observers without breaking their work rhythm. They said we've got this to each other not as a performance of confidence, but as a statement of fact, a fact they then proceeded to demonstrate. The Dreth have a strategic model for species that fight. They do not have a strategic model for species that remain entirely themselves while fighting. I believe humanity is that species. I recommend Category 1 provisional membership without reservation, and I recommend further that the Sovereignty Council consider what it means that it took humanity, with 4 decades of observation data available to us, 31 days to demonstrate what our existing frameworks were not equipped to recognize. Perhaps our frameworks were the problem. The Council voted 29-2 in favor. Category 1 provisional membership. The ceremony was held on the Varanasi's main deck on a Thursday. Naledi Dlamini received the membership token, a small crystalline thing, dark blue, that contained the formal sovereignty recognition signal, from Velkarath's hand. They stood there for a moment after. Velkarath said something. Than translated, "The assessor says the Dreth will come, and when they come they will not find what they expect." Dlamini said, "No, they won't." She held the crystal up to the light for a moment. Then she said, "Tell the assessor, tell it that we meant it, every word." Than translated. Velkarath looked at her. All 6 eyes. And then Assessor Seal, the junior analyst who'd spent 31 days making that hum-click sound every time something surprised it, who'd sat in an alcove with Dawit Bikel and his novels, who'd watched Cadet Adami reroute his station without asking for help, who'd been there when Priya Mehta handed a conduit clamp to an alien without missing a beat. Assessor Seal made a new sound. Not the hum-click. Something longer. Something that resonated in a frequency you could almost feel in your sternum. We asked Than later what it meant. Than was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "In Tharan there's no perfect translation. The closest would be something like 'I believe you.'" Segment 8, the Dreth and what came after. The Dreth came 8 months later. I'm not going to tell you that story in full today, because it deserves its own telling, and this account is already long, and I want to be honest about what I was there for, and what I only heard secondhand. What I'll tell you is what I know. The first engagement was at the outer marker of the Sol system, roughly where the old Voyager probes used to be, out in the termination shock, the place where the sun's influence starts to lose its argument with interstellar space. 41 JDF ships, including the Varanasi. 31 sovereignty warships from 3 member species, fighting alongside us. The Dreth sent 97 units of the type their advanced intelligence suggested was sufficient to consume a Class 3 uncontrolled variable species, which was their classification for us. What they found was not what their intelligence had suggested. What they found was 4,312 people on a single ship who had spent 14 months preparing for exactly this, who had been watched and measured and found to be something that the sovereignty's 400-year-old assessment framework didn't have a category for, who had a 26-year-old mechanic who fixed engines for personal reasons, and an admiral who said, "We've got this the way you say good morning," and a kid from Nigeria who at 18 years old rerouted a navigation station in the middle of a simulated alien contact without missing a beat. The engagement lasted 11 hours. The Dreth withdrew. In 3,100 years of expansion, it was only the 4th time they'd withdrawn from a primary contact engagement. The Tharan archives later recorded it as the sovereignty's most efficient first contact defensive action in the last 600 years. Velkarath, who had remained in the Sol system as a liaison officer after the membership ceremony, filed an addendum to its original assessment report. It was 2 sentences. Assessment confirmed, they meant every word. I've told you the big moments because that's what makes a story. But the thing I want to tell you, the thing that I think Velkarath was actually trying to say in that 47-page report, the thing that took me years to understand, is that the big moments weren't what mattered. The big moments were just the visible part of something that had been building in the small moments. In Dawit Bikel reading the Count of Monte Cristo in a storage alcove at 600 every morning, because he understood, without being able to articulate it, without it being in any regulation or doctrine, that the interior life is not a luxury. It's the source. You don't get the calibration and the rerouting and the 11-hour engagement and the withdrawal if you don't get the 30 minutes of reading first. You don't get the well if you don't tend the spring. In Priya Mehta spending 6 days hunting a ghost fault in an engine, not because she was ordered to, not because it was her shift, not because it was operationally required, but because SGT. Olive had a daughter who was 8 months old and he was trying to get home. As if those two things, the fault and the daughter, were connected, as if they were always connected, as if they had never been anything other than connected. In Naledi Dlamini shaking Velkarath's forearm at a docking collar and saying my people need to concentrate, not as a display of strength, but as the simple statement of a person who knows what she has and trusts it completely. In an 18-year-old cadet who was clearly terrified turning to the person next to him and saying I need a feed from your secondary, and the person next to him saying you have the right without missing a beat, because they drilled it until it was in their bones, because that's what humans do with the things that matter. They repeat them until they stop being practice and start being nature. In the Admiral at 300 with coffee in her hand, saying we've got this to a bridge full of people in the dark. We've got this. Not I've got this. We've. That's the word right there. That's the whole word. We've. Final segment, the ending, what I think about now. I left the Varanasi 18 months after the Dreth engagement. Normal rotation. Nothing dramatic. I filed my departure papers, packed my kit, shook a lot of hands in a lot of corridors, and took the shuttle back to Earth and stood in a field in the countryside where my grandmother lived and looked at the sky for a very long time. The sky looked the same. That's the thing about knowing what's out there. The sky looks exactly the same. But you look at it differently. I got a message, about a year after I left the ship, from interpreter Than. I don't know how it got my personal contact details. The Maxuri are apparently very good at that kind of thing. The message was short. It said that Velkarath had been assigned to a new assessment, a species on the far side of the consortium border that had recently achieved rudimentary interstellar capability and been flagged for the protocol. It said that before beginning the new assessment, Velkarath had reviewed all of its previous assessment files. It said that Velkarath had noted in its personal log, not the official report, the personal log, the thing an assessor keeps for themselves, that the Varanasi file was the one it returned to most often. And the reason it gave, in its personal log, for why it returned to that file was to remember what readiness actually looks like. I sat with that for a long time. Readiness. Not strength, not numbers, not technology or tactical doctrine or weapons calibration or any of the things you'd put in a formal assessment. Readiness. The state of being so fully, completely, stubbornly yourself, so committed to all the small things that make you human, the novels and the coffee and the personal repairs and the 2-second decisions to rescue strangers and the weave, always the weave, that, when the pressure comes, and it always comes, there's nothing to compress, nothing to reduce, nothing to lose, because you haven't made yourself smaller to prepare for the fight. You've stayed exactly as large as you always were. And when the Dreth came, when they came with 97 units and 3,100 years of accumulated expansion strategy, and the absolute confidence of a predator that has never, not once, encountered prey that didn't eventually break, they found 4,312 people who had not made themselves smaller, who had not compressed, who were exactly as large as they'd always been. And the Dreth, for the first time in 6 centuries, did not know what to do with that. They'd heard humans say we've got this. And humanity proved every word.